Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 16 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks. They took on the Florida Panthers and won by a score of 3-1. And over these last couple of years, the Florida Panthers have been the most dominant team in the entire NHL, having won back-to-back Stanley Cups. And when you are a team that wins so many games, it will naturally come with people who start to dislike your organization. It comes with the territory. But the thing is that the Florida Panthers, they kind of take it to the next level. There are some very real reasons for why most people outside of Florida do not like this team. And it's because that over these last couple of years, the Florida Panthers have left complete devastation wherever they have gone during their playoff runs, whether it be the Maple Leafs, the Lightning, the Oilers, the Rangers, the Hurricanes. It does not matter. If your team has the misfortune of going up against the Florida Panthers in a playoff series, you will come to understand why so many people really dislike them. But the thing is that as Sharks fans, the San Jose Sharks have not made the playoffs in multiple years, plus they are in the Western Conference, and so the only real experience the Sharks have had with the Florida Panthers over these last few seasons have been a couple of regular season games, and more often than not, in fact, pretty much almost every single time over these last few years, the San Jose Sharks have lost their regular season matchup against Florida, and have actually kind of been buried by them as well, to the point where the Panthers don't really have to bring their A game, and so there hasn't been much of an experience, so you can kind of watch this from far and understand why people don't really like them, but you don't really get it at its core level because you don't have that emotional investment. Well, this season things have changed a little bit. The Sharks and the Panthers are actually kind of close to the same level, at least they are in the standings. This is because, for one, the San Jose Sharks have improved significantly thus far this season, but also because the Florida Panthers are dealing with a ton of injuries thus far. No Alexander Barkov, no Matthew Tkachuk, so they are definitely at a weakened state at this point. And so in this matchup, they did actually have to kind of bring a good effort if they wanted the opportunity to win this game. And so the Sharks did get that kind of full Florida Panthers experience. It is, of course, outside of the playoffs, and so maybe not quite at the same level as most do experience it, but still, you kind of did begin to really understand why that hate does exist. Now, there's the kind of legal side that the Florida Panthers do bring. They are, of course, an incredibly tough team to play against just by the way that they play the game. They are a heavy forechecking team, the best in the entire NHL. Many people complain when their team, oh, I hate when they dump and chase the puck. It does not work. Well, the Florida Panthers, they make it work absolutely so well. They are the best team in the league in this area on top of that. Plus, they are the kind of crowning jewel in a way of the NHL. People talk about how the NHL is a copycat league. Everybody just goes after what works. Well, the Florida Panthers are what work, and so they can just kind of stick to their own game and do it exceptionally well. On top of this, they are a team that both attacks and defends with layers. They always have support for the puck carrier or against the puck carrier, and so you can find it extremely difficult to actually be able to find any real open space in either zone against this team. And as such, it can definitely be a frustrating experience, but it is not just the kind of legal side, the way that they play the game, that makes it all that tough. It is, of course, the extracurriculars that the Florida Panthers get up to. They constantly walk the line every single night. They are a team that abuses the kind of soft pick plays. Now, every single team goes for this without any exception. The San Jose Sharks are one of them as well, but the Panthers, they turn that up to 11. They will always try to have a guy who impedes your progress without crossing that line to be able to end up taking a penalty. Really, the Florida Panthers strategy in so many of these games is to have so many of these small infractions that there's a little bit of a fatigue from the referees, where there's like 30 different things that could be called for a penalty, but they're all minor enough that they can't quite go there, and so the Florida Panthers are able to eke out small advantages over and over and over again. But at the same time, there are multiple moments where they do fully cross that line, where they are deserving of a penalty call, but for whatever reason here tonight, and as many people say, for whatever reason usually, the referees don't exactly find those calls. So there was the too many men on the ice here. We saw Adam Gaudette get tripped behind the Panthers net with no call. We saw Celebrini get interfered with and cross-checked on the same shift with no call. In the last couple of minutes, we saw Will Smith take a boarding call. No call there either. And so there were multiple moments here tonight where the Panthers easily could have ended up going on the penalty kill, but it did not happen time and time again. However, not to focus on this too much. The Sharks do still end up emerging with the victory, so no sour grapes here, but it is certainly interesting, and the Sharks finally kind of being let into the club, so to speak, of hating that Florida Panthers team for sure. Now, when it comes to this game, I mentioned yesterday how the San Jose Sharks were able to grab that 2-1 victory over the Winnipeg Jets, and I had mentioned how that was actually a very impressive victory because it wasn't one where their goaltender had to completely stand on his head, and San Jose were actually able to outplay the Winnipeg Jets throughout much of that game. Well, this one, it definitely was a little bit more of a squeaker. This was a game where the San Jose Sharks were heavily reliant on their goaltender to come up with multiple big saves to help keep them alive in this one. It maybe wasn't as dominant as it looked. I think the Sharks actually did a pretty decent job of actually truly limiting the extremely high danger opportunities. Like you think of the big saves that Askarov had to make. There was like a couple, for instance, one on Evan Rodriguez on a really good kind of odd man rush for the Florida Panthers, but otherwise he was just mostly very solid. And while there were good scoring chances for the Florida Panthers, there wasn't a ton of grade A opportunities. So there is some credit that does have to go to the San Jose Sharks side, but still, they were hemmed into their own zone for extended periods of time here, in particular the second and the third period. But the first, it starts out actually with the Sharks' favor. They score the first goal of this game. That is Macklin Celebrini's 10th of the entire season, assisted by, of course, Will Smith. That makes it 1-0 San Jose. In the second period, the Sharks strike early. That one comes from Adam Gaudette to make it 2-0, but then the Florida Panthers pretty much completely take over this game. They get a goal very soon after from Brad Marchand. This is on a kind of an interesting one where Askarov loses his mask. There was a question of whether or not this should have counted. I think it was a good goal because this mask, of course, it does come off, but a scoring chance is immediately imminent here for Florida, and so I don't think that they should have called that one off. It was fine. 2-1 there at that point for San Jose, and then the Florida Panthers, they do push. They get shots, they get decent scoring chances, but nothing is able to beat Askarov, and eventually it is an Alex Wenberg empty netter that puts this one away for San Jose. The 3-1 victory here as they beat the defending President Trophy winners and the defending Stanley Cup champions on back-to-back night to now put themselves into a position where they have what is technically considered to be a winning record here in the NHL, 7-6-3 across their first 16 games of this season. Moving on to the players to talk about the no changes actually to the Sharks forward group. The players who are injured still remain injured. No William Eklund here tonight, though I suspect and hope that he is pretty close. And of course, no Michael Misa as well. He is still week to week there. And so the top line, it does remain to be yet again Celebrini, Smith, and Toffoli. Celebrini here in this one, we saw him manage to strike and actually have a very solid, very good, dominant type of first period that you would expect. And he scores that goal. He makes it 1-0 San Jose. But then once the second period comes along, the Florida Panthers, as I said, they kind of turn on their style of play, and Celebrini was not given a single break here in this one. There was always a guy on him, and when I say on him, I don't mean, shadowing him. I mean like a guy in his face, basically interfering with him, preventing him from doing much of anything. He didn't get any calls here tonight. It was definitely a bit of a rough game in the sense, not because Celebrini was playing poorly, but a rough game in the sense that the Florida Panthers just never gave him a single bit of space to try and work with over these last 40 minutes. I still thought as a whole, Celebrini was actually one of the best players for the San Jose Sharks, but this is the type of experience that he does kind of have to get used to. Teams are going to mark them when they come in with a game plan against the San Jose Sharks. They're not worried about what Ryan Reeves is going to do. They're not worried about what Barclay Goodrow or Ty Delangelo or these players are going to do. They're worried about what Macklin Celebrini is going to do. They're worried about where he's going to be on the ice. And as the Sharks actually become more of a kind of serious team around the NHL, once teams actually have to kind of create a game plan against San Jose instead of just sort of like letting loose and just allowing things to happen and probably still getting the victory anyway, they will be more prepared for what Celebrini is going to bring, and there will be more nights like this one that they had against the Florida Panthers, and we'll see how Celebrini is able to adjust to that. But I mean, it's tough, especially against Florida. I mean, there's a reason why they have won back-to-back Stanley Cups. There's a reason why Connor McDavid has gone from absolutely dominating the first 3 rounds of the playoffs and then just getting completely slowed down to a halt against Florida. They know what they need to do, and Celebrini, a little bit of a victim of that here tonight, but still actually a pretty good outing, and so you still have to be rather impressed with him. When it comes to his 2 line mates, these are the types of moments where you do have to lean on your 2 line mates a little bit more, because if they have a guy or even a couple of guys on Celebrini, that means that there's going to be a slightly more space for his teammates. Now, Will Smith, I do think Smith had an okay outing here in this game. Great pass to Celebrini on the one goal that he scored, but he was also a little bit of a victim of the lack in time of space that existed here tonight. And when it comes to the other line mate, Tyler Toffoli, I have already mentioned many times in the past that this is a situation where Toffoli, he can have good games, but you would look for a little bit more speed and pace out of this player, and especially against a team like Florida, it is tough to go one-on-one with them and try to really grind it out, because they are the best in the business at being able to do that. And so you might want to try a different approach, might want to try a speedy type of approach, stretch out the game, not allow Florida to get into their comfortable level, and Toffoli doesn't really bring that to this top line, and so it's slightly unfortunate there. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, Wenberg, Graf, and Kurashev, those three do end up remaining together after a not necessarily amazing game the other night against the Winnipeg Jets, but they were pretty responsible in their own zone. You could sort of make the argument that that kind of happened again here tonight, but at the same time, it was a situation where this second line couldn't really get much generated at all. I look at, for instance, Philip Kurashev, who I thought was practically invisible here tonight. His big thing was that he took that one tripping penalty. Otherwise, he didn't really do much in this game whatsoever. Alex Wenberg, he does manage to pick up that empty netter, but one thing that did stand out a bit was that there were actually a couple of moments here tonight where Alex Wenberg had a good shooting lane towards the net, and especially against a team like the Florida Panthers, you have to take your chances where you get them. And of course, we know that Wenberg, it has been a decade plus at this point of his career where he just refuses to shoot the puck. So you are kind of used to it, but at the same time, you can't just make excuses like, well, yeah, no, that's just Alex Wenberg. You have to get that puck towards the net, and it felt as though he just stalled a little bit in multiple different occasions. That could have come back to bite the Sharks here in this game. When it comes to Colin Graf, I actually thought he was a good bright spot on this second line. Defensively in his own zone, I thought he did, as usual, a pretty good job, but we do also have to highlight the Sharks' penalty kill in this particular game, a perfect 5 for 5, which was extremely impressive. We saw it the other night against the Seattle Kraken. They were a perfect 6 for 6, but there were a few cracks showing in that one, so I wasn't ready to celebrate about the Sharks' penalty kill being back. Here tonight, obviously, there were some chances, but I thought they did a very good job of preventing the Panthers from actually scoring that all-important goal that would have tied this game, and of course, Colin Graf is a huge part of that. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, Skinner, Dellandrea, and Cardwell, they actually had a very strong start to this game. Jeff Skinner in particular, his first 2-3 shifts, it felt as though he always had the puck, always managed to get a good chance on net, but it very quickly fell off. The second period was not as good, and then the third period was definitely somewhat of a struggle, and so as it kind of turned on a little bit, Jeff Skinner faded into the background. It was an interesting kind of rematch for him because he was, of course, with the Edmonton Oilers last season, and the Oilers did play against the Florida Panthers in the Stanley Cup Finals, and perhaps we saw a little bit why Jeff Skinner was somewhat of a consistent healthy scratch during that series and during the playoffs as a whole. When it comes to Dellandrea and Cardwell, I'll say that I thought both of these players had some really solid moments in this game. Cardwell actually continues to impress me as a player who I feel is absolutely NHL ready. I just not really sure if he's going to have much of a home on this team, especially once Eklund returns, right? When he comes back into the lineup, who is actually going to sit out of these 12 forwards? It seems as though Cardwell could unfortunately end up being the odd man out at that point, especially since even though Kurashev maybe wasn't very good here tonight, they'll probably want to reunite Eklund with Wenberg and Kurashev, and so he might have to be the guy who steps out as that 13th forward. We shall see, but I have been impressed with him pretty much every single game he has played thus far. And the same goes for Ty Dellandrea, who I think as this third line center, it's not been great. It's not as though that's been a very dominant third line, but they've had some really good moments, and so I can't be too upset by Dellandrea. Plus, should note, he is also a key penalty killer here for the San Jose Sharks, and he has also contributed strongly in that area. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, this was an interesting one. Gaudreau, Gaudette, and Ryan Reeves. I'll start off with Ryan Reeves, who continues to somehow find himself with offensive chances in these games. He doesn't play a ton, and yet it's what's happening. We saw it the other night against the Winnipeg Jets. He had that good kind of one-on-one moment. It didn't lead to much, but he came pretty close to it. Here tonight against the Florida Panthers, he had a 2-on-1 that he actually came pretty close to actually putting the puck in the net for his third goal of the season. So Reeves is managing to show up in an offensive sense. What I found funny here, however, or not really funny, but kind of a little odd, I would say, is that this was the type of game that you really thought Ryan Reeves would thrive in from a physical standpoint. And there was that one hit onto Gustav Forsling in the third period that did get a rise out of the crowd, but otherwise it felt as though he wasn't super effective of actually using his body from a physical standpoint. And then we also saw a situation, I mentioned it earlier on, where Macklin Celebrini was getting pretty abused at times on some of these shifts, the cross checks, the interference calls. The whole idea here, and I've brought this up in the past, the whole idea here of having Ryan Reeves was that he was going to provide like a protection for Macklin Celebrini and a lot of the Sharks' young players. Well, against this Florida Panthers team, it didn't really seem as though many players took too much pause with taking any liberties with San Jose Sharks, because Ryan Reeves was not really much of a deterrent at all. However, despite that, I still thought he actually had a pretty good game. Barclay Goodrow, I thought, was, again, quite impressive. His penalty kill work is definitely noted. I mean, even last year when he was just a complete disaster 5-on-5, like literally one of the worst players in the entire NHL, I always made sure to highlight that at least on the penalty kill, he was actually an above average player. That continues here this season, maybe even slightly better, depending on how you look at it. And so credit to Barclay Goodrow in that area. And when it comes to Adam Gaudette, does manage to score the goal. This is the game winner. I thought Gaudette had a little bit of extra juice here tonight, which was nice to see. And so this fourth line actually quite good in this game. When it comes to the Sharks' defensive pairings, the big thing to note here, no Shakir Mukhamadullin tonight, so he steps out. Sam Dickinson steps back in, and this brings up a major issue with the San Jose Sharks defensive core moving forward, which is that they simply have too many players. I talked about this yesterday in my review of the Winnipeg Jets game. Right now, where the Sharks are at, they should want to have Sam Dickinson and Shakir Mukhamadullin in the lineup every single night. Occasionally, you would have Sam Dickinson step out. That, I guess, could be fine, especially if he's not playing well. But even then, I feel as though he should be pretty much an every-nighter. But where they stand currently, that is not a setup that Ryan Warsofsky is going with. He's talking about how, Shakir Mukhamadullin needs these nights off. Well, Mukhamadullin is a relatively developed defenseman. He's not a guy who's playing his first few games in a man's league or anything like that. Mukhamadullin is 23 years old. He spent a decent amount of time in the KHL. He has more playoff experience in a man's league than even Mario Ferraro has. Not to say that he's more of a veteran player, but it's just, it's kind of funny when you look at it in that way. So to me, not only is Mukhamadullin one of the best defensemen that the Sharks actually have, like he's a top 3 player here, really only behind firmly Dmitry Orlov. Everybody else, it's kind of a conversation, but he is also that type of young guy that you want to be giving game action to. And this is all happening before even Nick Leddy comes off of the injured reserve, which would of course throw a wrench into this situation even further. So at this point, Mike Greer, I've talked about how a trade is probably imminent. I really continue to feel that way because the Sharks cannot possibly go forward with having all 8 of these defensemen. I mean, 9 if you count Iorio, but even just sort of putting him to the side for a second, they cannot go forward with having all 8 of these defensemen in the NHL. I do not want to see a single game where both Mukhamadullin and Dickinson find themselves on the bench so that the Sharks' third defensive pairing is Daharn and Leddy. That should never happen. So something does have to give, and we'll see what that ends up being. When it comes to this top pairing for the San Jose Sharks, Orlov and Liljegren, I talked about how Jeff Skinner was facing off against, his previous playoff opponent, the Florida Panthers. The same goes for Dmitry Orlov. It's actually quite interesting if you think about it. The Florida Panthers might be the reason for why the Sharks even have Dmitry Orlov in the first place, because last year with the Hurricanes, he was actually having a pretty decent season. Things were going decently well for him, and so he was probably looked at rather favorably by most teams in the NHL, but his final bit of games in that season were against this Florida Panthers team, and he was a complete disaster throughout that entire season, to the point where there were probably many teams who were somewhat interested in signing him to a contract that offseason who decided if he can't compete against the best team in the league, the Florida Panthers, why would I want to pick him up? And so he ends up signing this contract instead with the San Jose Sharks. And to his credit, outside of those first couple of games, he has been playing very well as of late and has been that kind of number 1 guy that the Sharks were hoping to get. However, here in this matchup, you're hoping Orlov would be able to redeem himself, but it does seem as though the Florida Panthers are a little bit his kryptonite because this was not a good game from Dmitry Orlov. I thought he was abused on multiple different shifts. There were some times he was able to make some decent decent plays, so it wasn't all bad for Dmitry Orlov, but there were a lot of times where he was getting stripped of the puck, where he was making the incorrect passes. There was one particular shift where he goes for a pass, it's intercepted, then tries to step up in the neutral zone to prevent a chance. It goes the other way for a 2-on-1, and then later on, just a few seconds later, he makes another mistake that gives the puck away. Like, it was not a great night for Dmitry Orlov whatsoever. Keep him away from this Florida Panthers team at this point, because it doesn't look pretty when he goes up against that organization. And when it comes to his defensive partner, Timothy Liljegren, I actually thought Liljegren, this is rare that I would say this, Liljegren has been playing well, although recently not so much, but he was actually better, I thought, than Dmitry Orlov, but not by a significant margin of any sort of stretch, but I thought he was slightly better in that area. But this was still a defensive pairing that found themselves playing in that defensive zone quite consistently throughout this game. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing here, we have Klingberg and Ferraro. Klingberg did not really get to do much offensively here tonight. He was kind of flying, not flying in the sense of like skating, but making some really, really good plays yesterday against the Winnipeg Jets. That did not carry through here to tonight. Obviously, the Panthers, they do play a relatively tight game, but still, there were the opportunities to try and create something, and Klingberg was not capable of doing that. There were then also a few defensive errors that, kind of burned the San Jose Sharks at times here. I don't think he was maybe as bad as Orlov was, but this was still not a particularly great game from John Klingberg. When it comes to his defensive partner, Mario Ferraro, I'll give credit for him on the penalty kill. There was that one in the third period where he was doing a ton of heroics to help keep the San Jose Sharks alive, and so a lot of credit does need to go there. I have been talking about how a trade is somewhat imminent here for the San Jose Sharks, and I've mentioned both Timothy Liljegren and Mario Ferraro as potential targets. It's tough to say that because Mario Ferraro, despite his many, many faults as a player, the one thing you can never say about him is that he didn't give his effort, even at times where the San Jose Sharks were tanking games, even at times where they would just lose constantly over and over and over. Mario Ferraro was always that one player who would show up and give his best possible effort no matter what, and it's tough to move on from a player like that, but it's possible that the Sharks will end up doing so. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, as I said, Dickinson steps back into the lineup here. He ends up on this defensive pairing with Daharn, and normally I would start with Dickinson because as the young player, he obviously, is much more interesting to talk about, but I have to instead start with Vincent Daharn, because what I will say here tonight is that amongst every single San Jose Sharks defenseman, Daharn was by far the best that the Sharks had in his game. He was on point. He was locked in. We have seen throughout much of this season that the San Jose Sharks have been somewhat limiting Daharn's ice time, not trying to get him any more than 16 or so minutes in any particular game, because he is that kind of slower player and doesn't really feel as though he would be able to thrive in a 20-minute night, but he ends up hitting over 20 minutes here in this game. We saw Warsofsky go with Daharn on multiple tough occasions, including the final few minutes of this game with the Panthers having the goaltender pulled, and this was the correct choice because Daharn was looking so good throughout this game, so solid. His penalty kill work was exceptional, I thought. So strong in front of the net. This was the type of game that honestly you kind of expected him a little bit to be able to thrive in. He has that type of size and physicality to be able to hold himself and hold his own against this type of Florida Panthers squad, and I thought he did that marvelously. And so, you talk about, and this goes back to the Sharks not having much space in the lineup, you talk about how trying to get Dickinson and Mukhamadullin to play on every given night, and I mentioned how Daharn would be that seventh defenseman, but putting up games like this and penalty kill efforts like this, it's going to be very difficult to pull him out of the lineup as well, which again speaks to the point of something having to give here, and if everyone is playing very, very well, it's tough to see what that ends up being. When it comes to his defensive partner, Sam Dickinson, like I said, he is always someone who is very interesting to talk about. I did not like the fact that Sam Dickinson didn't play yesterday. My big thing was that he had played his best game of the season against Detroit, then a very solid outing against the Seattle Kraken, and you would want to really kind of stoke those flames of confidence that Sam Dickinson had across both of those games, and by removing him from the lineup against Winnipeg, you would kind of take the wind out of his sails a little bit. And here tonight, it's kind of hard to say whether or not that actually is what happened. Obviously, Dickinson did not have nearly as many kind of moments where he tried to jump into the play offensively as he did previously, and one could argue that that is a situation where he's just not really feeling it anymore, and I could say that that is potentially the Sharks' fault for creating that type of situation. But at the same time, it is difficult going up against the defending Stanley Cup champions, and Sam Dickinson, we saw a couple of times in that first period, he was a little bit shell-shocked with the type of pressure that the Florida Panthers were actually able to bring. In fact, the last time that Sam Dickinson had to go up against a team like this was all the way back game 2 of the season for himself, which was the Carolina Hurricanes, and he really struggled in that game. The aggressive forecheck of the Carolina Hurricanes was too much for, at the time, Sam Dickinson to handle, and so I do want to commend him for actually the progress that he has made from then to now, because Florida plays, a somewhat similar style to Carolina, but they just sort of do it better. That's why the Panthers always just easily dominate the Hurricanes when it comes to their playoff series over these last few seasons, and the fact that Dickinson was able to hold his own, there were, as I said, a couple of hiccups in that first period, but he actually was able to settle in decently well after that and play a relatively solid defensive game, which I was somewhat impressed with, I felt, as this one went on. He didn't get much ice time, and so it's not as though you're still going to sing his praises completely and say, wow, Dickinson was so fantastic, but in a really, really difficult situation here for himself, where he sat out yesterday, which you could certainly argue killed his confidence a little bit, he ends up putting up a pretty good effort in this one. And then finally we get to the Sharks goaltender, Yaroslav Askarov. I was really, really high on Vincent Daharn, and I think out of the forwards and defensemen, he may have been the San Jose Sharks MVP here tonight. But when you consider the goaltender as well, it is no contest. Yaroslav Askarov wins this game for the San Jose Sharks. There was a lot of talk back at the beginning of the season about how, Askarov is really worrying. But I always made sure to mention, it's very early. It had only been a few games. And the thing is that as a goaltender, it's tough when you have a bit of a slow start, because it can cost your team's game quite directly. If you're a young forward and you maybe don't have the best couple of outings, it doesn't really matter as much. But when you're a young goaltender and that's the situation, well, you end up in games like against Anaheim or against Los Angeles or whatsoever. But Askarov has clearly figured it out at this point. That mental block, he seems to have been able to move past that. And now he is giving the San Jose Sharks winning hockey. He is giving the San Jose Sharks the ability to steal some of these games against top competition. One goal given up here tonight, and it was one that you can't even really blame him for. He gets his mask taken off by Dmitry Orlov cutting across there in front of the crease, and so he basically has no chance on this Brad Marchand goal. Otherwise, he was stellar. He was perfect here in this one. Not really enough praise that you could possibly give to Yaroslav Askarov. Again, MVP of the game for the San Jose Sharks. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday. They'll be taking on the Minnesota Wild. Now, the last time the Sharks played the Minnesota Wild, it was a crazy back-and-forth game where the Sharks held multiple 2-goal leads, let them slip away, but then eventually had that amazing breakaway overtime game winner from Macklin Celebrini to claim that victory. And now, a couple of weeks later, the Sharks are going up against them once again, but both teams have kind of been trending in a different directions. The Minnesota Wild have struggled throughout much of this season thus far. The San Jose Sharks, meanwhile, are on the up and up, and we shall see if they can continue with these strong games that they have been putting up. Class dismissed.